university, no one is saying spend a lot of time with policymakers. I have spent time with policymakers, and I know that a huge amount of effort and energy can be absorbed, sometimes to very little effect, because they don't like what you're telling them. That was one thing. Secondly, I have been reflecting in the last few weeks on why is it that no one ever queries the relationship between blood pressure and cardiovascular diseases, but everyone is always querying diet, physical activity, and many other things, and clearly it's about vested interests. The quality of the evidence is identical. Indeed, probably for some other factors, the evidence is better than it is for blood pressure, but no one ever mounts an argument against saying that this is merely an association, etc. So it's about vested interest, and that's why I think perhaps we need to understand that even more, as David Stuckler was saying. So I'd like the panel perhaps to comment on these observations. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll ask the members of the panel to answer these questions, and then we'll have another round of questions. Who'd like to go first?
Well, let me take these in reverse order. I think it's a fascinating point. No one argues against blood pressure. It'd be a great study to look at which areas of public health evidence are the most contested. But you're exactly right. We need to get a grip on vested interests. The changing nature of the academic job, the UK is experimenting with research assessment exercises which now incorporate components of impact to the disgruntlement of many, but I think it's a step in the right direction. It's often said, as a cliche, need is the mother of all invention, and in our experience, by interacting with policymakers, it can feed into the creative research process. It can open up grant resources so that engagement is mutually consistent and reinforcing with academic pressures. The first two questions, I really like the comment about the public being an observer and the analogy of sports. If it were possible to get the public to enjoy public health debates as much as they enjoy football, we'd be having a different discussion right now. It's a great analogy. We also need to keep in mind the referees who need to be on the field. Ben Cave mentions health impact assessment. Will someone please do a health impact assessment of the European Central Bank and Troika's policies on austerity? It's way overdue. And the final question is, working with industry a bad thing? It comes down to a question of alignment of interest. We've argued in support of Johnson & Johnson partnering with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and funding health policy professionals, postdocs, some who we've worked with, to roll out and develop the evidence base around smoking cessation. So yes, there are examples of good practices that do work, and where successful, we should replicate those.
I'm just going to mix them up a little bit because I think that they're all interlinked. First of all, blood pressure. I'm old enough to remember the 1970s when Ivan Illich was convinced that medicalization of society was a very bad thing, and then blood pressure treatment was the most activist-oriented topic. So maybe we have fashions in where we lay the blame, and sometimes we need to change the topic that we ask attention for, because I remember vividly the moment when raising tobacco yet again meant that you were simply put aside in the public health debate with politicians and policymakers. And it's being creative and bringing it back on the agenda time after time that helps. I don't think working with industry is always bad. On the contrary, I think that we would not have achieved what we have achieved in public health if we did not have industry to make certain things. We cannot make vaccines. We cannot make screening equipment. We need industry to make products. But we have to be aware of their interests. And it's not only a conflict of interest with industry. I can tell you we're currently working on an advisory report on chronic Lyme disease, and I can tell you the conflict of interest with the patient pressure groups there is maybe much more intense than it ever is with industry. But we do have to take these groups, these stakeholders seriously, and that's why I like the suggestion of the EVNet as a method of sharing those discussions, we have a tendency to think that if we've had that debate once with the public and the policymakers and the researchers, we've done our homework. But that's not the case. You probably have to do it time and time again at a local level, because the decisions affect people at a local level. And it doesn't help to only have the formal representatives of those stakeholders at a national or at an international level. And that's a very time-consuming thing. And most researchers, as the gentleman in the back rightly said, are not being paid for doing these things. On the other hand, if we take valorization seriously, and we do in the sense that we get our researchers to work in translating basic research into the kind of knowledge that companies can take over to make products, then we from the public health field should feel that putting time and energy in convincing people why policy measures are necessary is just as worthwhile. And most European universities have a long tradition whereby you have three responsibilities. It's teaching, it's research, and it is something for society. And it's named in a different way in many countries. And we kind of abolished that in the 90s when we had the research exercise movement, and maybe it's time to bring that back.
I'll just make two comments. One, I'd really like to second Louise's remarks about evidence to action is not like a one-time immunization. There is an amazing degree of turnover among decision makers at all levels. In a project that I was very involved with in Ecuador, we had 5 ministers of health in 18 months. And the situation is not much better at our state decision-making levels in the US. So it's over and over and over again, which leads me to my second comment, and that's about the academic system of rewards. We're generally not paid to try to influence policy. When I go to Annapolis, which is our state capital, and talk about a piece of legislation and try to bring research evidence to bear, I'm usually going up against lobbyists who are paid full-time, to be on the other side of the table. So what is it we can do about that? And I'll give an example, not of a solution, but of an attempt to address this. At the School of Public Health at Hopkins right now, all faculty are supposed to do research, teach, have service activities, which we define as our contributions to the school and to our profession, and practice, which we define as our obligation to our varying communities. Well, it's easy to measure. We have developed measurements for research contributions, teaching contributions, including teaching quality and service contributions. It's practice that's a frontier that we really need to do a lot more work developing measures that can be used by appointments, promotions, and reward committees. So I think this is our obligation. We need to work together to do this.
Thank you. We have around 10 minutes, so I can take another round of questions.
My name is Helmut Brandt, Maastricht University, but before I came to Maastricht, I was a civil servant. And somehow this group of people is missing in this discussion. Scientists rarely speak directly to the Minister of Health, or sometimes you had a hearing, but the day-to-day work is done in the Ministry of Health, and you have a lot of civil servants who do exactly this job, translating new evidence in policy making. And the famous quote is, "I don't mind who is minister below me or under my, because ministers come and go, civil servants stay, and they have often a long-term vision." And I would like to hear your opinion how we can educate and then how we can help them, because there are a lot of masters of public health running around them who try to do their job.
Thank you.
My name is Anders Volsmann from Aarhus University, Denmark. Thank you for this important discussion and the fine way you put it forward. I would like, however, because we are in an academic circumstance here, I would like to play a little bit the devil's advocate. Now, looking at the chain from research to practice, then I think we have a couple of questions. We have actually many questions, but one of them would be, yes, but do we agree so much about what is evidence? There was the sentence formulated like this, that is, for instance, screening for breast cancer still the best way to do it, to prevent breast cancer? And I think it's a right way to rephrase it, to ask, was it ever the best way? Where are we? So when will evidence be so good evidence that we also, based on moral, ethical considerations, can say, now we agree? Let's remember one of the definitions of an academic, that an academic is a person who always disagrees with the last speaker. And that's something else than what you need when you have a system where you want to do things, because then you have to decide in the organization, now we do this, and that's not the way academia functions. So that's the problem here. How do we reach a point where we think that now evidence is good enough? There are so many people who are burning to get out into the field, to have their what they thought they found out, to have that implemented. So when is the scientific discussion mature enough for and ready for politicians and other decision makers? Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Ruth Richards from New Zealand, so not part of the EU yet. I'm just looking at the translation issue that we've got here between Raj's academic perspective, the industry perspective, the policy perspective, and the absent group of the people's perspective. And in my experience, there are different languages spoken by all of those groups of people. Is there a need for a translation agency so that we can actually get these people not only in the same room, but speaking the same language?
Yes. Okay, so I'll ask the panel to... There's another question?
Yes, thank you.
Please.
Francisco Becerra from Mexico, working at the Council of Health Research for Development. I totally agree with the lady from New Zealand that an agency or a unit within the Ministries of Health is needed, because you have to create a culture of using research results. And you have to bring someone, which is the missing link, to really establish the bridge to really do the implementation of evidence. So there's also a responsibility on the researcher side, because most of us are using public money, public funds to do research. So what are we doing with that research? Just engrossing our own CVs, or trying to do research for public's health? So that's something we have to think as researchers. And civil servants, people working in the Ministry of Health, they have to be aware that the research the country is funding also has a need to be used and to be implemented some way. And EVIPNet, which has been very, very important in developing countries, is something that has to be closer to the Ministries of Health, because Ministries of Health should understand the value of research. So probably Europe can learn a lot of EVIPNet and developing countries working. And there is a very nice booklet called Support, which was produced by Andy Oxman in Norway and John Levis in Canada, that gives you all this information on how to bridge the gap, strategies and actions that someone in a research unit or within the Ministry of Health can really start doing as to bring researchers and policymakers together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'll ask the members of the panel. Would you like to go first?
I think this needs only a very quick reaction. Many of the translation agencies that exist, and the Health Council in the Netherlands is one, and IOM is a very similar type of organization, bring together scientists and the civil servants. Because I agree that those have to be at the same table to help the policy-making decision. And I also think that we need to accept that as good researchers, every question we answer puts forward the next question that we would like to answer. And there is a moment when you do have to say we can take a policy decision even if we do not have the full evidence available yet. And if we cannot do that, then the public can question whether the research money that's put forward is truly useful to society.
I'll just add one more thought to that. You know, I think in my talk it sounded like big evidence leads to big action, leads to big evaluation. I think it rarely works like that, and that's rarely the desirable approach. Getting into the field, so-called action research, I think teaches us more about the evidence and what is missing and further questions, you know, that need to be asked. So incremental changes, incremental action with built-in monitoring and evaluation that then leads to, you know, the creation of better and more evidence, I think is probably, you know, an approach that's superior.